Association of Nova Scotia, and Susan Clark, who is the Executive Director of Post-Secondary Education for the Department of Education, and Carol Lowthers, who is the Director of Private and Career Colleges, who has worked in the development of this legislation. Mr. Speaker, the association is responsible for regulating the industry in the province, and they wanted us to update the Act to increase consumer protection, and we were happy to be able to do that. You'll recall that last fall we passed amendments that expanded the definition of cosmetology to include aesthetics, which is a growing industry. The association now has the authority to regulate this previously unregulated industry. The amendments also gave the association the authority to set entrance requirements for cosmetology training programs. Mr. Speaker, with the amendments we're now proposing, there are two key changes. One deals with inspection and the other deals with handling complaints. The amendments include a provision that will give the Cosmetology Association the authority to inspect places where cosmetology services are delivered. And this provision was in the amendments we brought forward last fall. It was in the form of two deeming clauses that put the onus on a person to prove they weren't practicing cosmetology. However, some stakeholders found this wording troublesome, so we pulled those clauses to allow the rest of the legislation to pass. We continue to work with the stakeholders, and we now have agreement on the wording from everyone involved. Inspections will help the Cosmetology Association ensure that Nova Scotians have access to safe professional hairdressing and aesthetic services. When problems arise, however, there has to be a process in place for dealing with them. So our amendments include a provision for the association to receive and address complaints through a disciplinary process. Once this legislation passes, the Cosmetology Association will detail these processes in its bylaws. I want to thank the association's members for their patience throughout this period of updating their legislation. By working cooperatively, we now have the measures in place to improve consumer protection. And I'm confident that with the will of the House, we will soon have more measures in place to protect Nova Scotians. I know the association is eager to have these amendments passed so we can get on with the next steps for regulating the cosmetology industry. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank members for their attention and look forward to this bill proceeding through the various stages. Thank you.
Now, Member Timberley Prospect.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to making a few comments. I was told jokingly ahead of time that I could make up some comments. However, that is not the way to begin this important piece of legislation. I want you to know that I would like to thank and congratulate Ms. Carter and Ms. Clark and Ms. Lowthers for their input. And after all, that's how good legislation happens, is that the stakeholders are involved in the process. And it's, after all, part of the process when we look at legislation like this, particularly when we're looking at this growing industry. And I want the stakeholders who are present to know that in a previous career, I had the opportunity on numerous occasions to refer students of mine to this particular profession. It is, after all, a service industry. It's an important part of the opportunity for young people in our province to be well employed. But of course, the situation comes down to, as we all know, that there have to be regulations, there have to be controls, and the consumer, of course, has to be protected. And consumer protectionism, as we are well aware of, is an important part of the responsibilities that we have as legislators in this province. Having had the opportunity to look at some of the details, I also look forward to the next stage. And for those visitors over here, it's an important part of the process that when legislation is introduced, in this case by the Minister of Education, that we'll have the opportunity in the Red Room, we'll have the opportunity to hear from, or we could hear, it could be in the committee room, as my friend has just pointed out to me. We will have the opportunity to hear from Nova Scotians. We will have the opportunity to hear from the people involved and some of their comments on this particular piece of legislation. Because, the key concern, of course, comes down, as we all know, when it comes to legislation like this, it's not necessarily the rule, it's the exception to the rule. And I can tell you from previous experience, when you're dealing with whatever the profession is, that the consumer has to have the opportunity and the proper channels to lodge the complaints, because those things do happen in any profession. And it's really of some consequence that the consumers can have faith in the process and can be made aware of, whatever the profession, Mr. Speaker, that there is a way to deal with complaints, and in some cases, disciplinary complaints for whatever reason, because standards of professionalism in many ways are the judge, after all, of how a profession is responsible to its consumers, but is also responsible to itself. And Mr. Speaker, as you know from your previous experience and previous career, no matter what the career, we're often judged in terms of how we ourselves make the appropriate decisions when it comes to, and I will use the expression because of your career, Mr. Speaker, of policing our own profession. And again, it's consumer protectionism, but it's also to make sure that when we look at regulations of this nature with this particular business interest, that we're looking at protecting consumers and making sure that they have an opportunity to clearly be able to define if they do have a concern, if they do have a complaint, they know the process that has to be followed. And I want you to know also one of the concerns that are of real importance, whether it's in the Cosmetology Act, which we have in front of us, or other pieces of legislation similarly, it's important to make sure that we do know how schools of whatever level are recruiting young people, and I say young people, but they can be people of all ages, that they're recruiting potential students into this avocation. And Mr. Speaker, that's after all one of the real concerns that we always have as educators, that we're making it very clear to the young people who are choosing this as a potential career that they are aware of the implications of joining this particular business, of becoming a professional in this particular business, and of course the standards that are necessary when it comes to entering the profession, but also making sure that there is a high standard of performance in this particular industry, and that the stakeholders involved have a very clear definition of what the expectations are of the people in the profession. Mr. Speaker, as we are well aware of, when it comes to any kind of consultation, it's important that all consultation involves the fact that everyone involved would have had the opportunity to speak and to make sure that they feel comfortable with this legislation. The minister assures us that there has been a process that has taken place. I look forward to the opportunity of law amendments because, and I want the stakeholders and I want Nova Scotians to feel comfortable with the fact of how law amendments works in this province, Mr. Speaker, and it's a necessary step, it's a valuable step. I'm sure on this piece of legislation that we will hear representation, and the representation when they appear in front of the committee, there are 5 government members who are on the committee. There are also 2 members of the official opposition, of which I am proud to say I am a member of law amendments, and there are 2 members from the Liberal Party, at which time we have an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, as you are well aware, not just to listen to the representations in front of law amendments, but we also have the opportunity to ask questions. And it's during those question and answer period where we have the opportunity to engage the presenter to make sure that we as legislators understand fully the implications of this piece of legislation, whether there are pros, whether there are cons, whether there are particular points in a piece of legislation that they might want redefined. Because after all, these are the people that we have to continue to hear from. We have to continue to hear from the experts in whatever particular field or whatever particular avocation, so that we can make sure that as legislators, when it leaves law amendments and comes back to this House, that we are very clear on the intent of this piece of legislation. So I look forward to the opportunity to hearing from some of the people that have already been involved in the consultation. It is important for them to make sure that they present to us as legislators on all sides of the House that we are looking at the opportunity to make sure that this piece of legislation, an act to amend Chapter 5 of the Acts of 95-96, the Cosmetology Act, is the best possible piece of legislation that we can bring forward at this time. Now, when those witnesses appear in front of law amendments, I want them to understand that it's a real consequence in the time limits that they have. And the time limits are usually agreed to at various times because of the number of presenters. But if it's a 15-minute example only, Mr. Speaker, but if it's a 15-minute presentation, I encourage witnesses when they come forward on this bill number 52 that they give us the opportunity as legislators to be able to ask a few questions, to make sure that we fully understand some of the factors in this particular industry, in this particular profession, that perhaps we don't understand. And you know, as I've always said to students that I've had in my care, there is no such thing as a stupid question. It's a question that we have information we would like to request details on. It's a question of process. It's a question of why this is included or why that isn't included. And when we go to that next stage of law amendments, whether it's held here in the Red Room in our historic legislature or whether it's over to the committee room, I would hope that the witnesses would look at the fact that for a 15-minute presentation, and I would say out of guidelines, we certainly would like to have at the very outside half of that time so that we could have the opportunity to ask a few questions, to engage the witnesses so that they will understand or make us better understand exactly where we will be going with this piece of legislation. The key thing, of course, in this Cosmetology Act is that consumers feel comfortable that their interests are being protected. And from what we have heard thus far, and I'm sure we're going to hear it more further in law amendments, that is, after all, the intent, the ideal intent of a piece of legislation in this province and in this legislature, that we bring forth legislation that does have the best interest of all involved, the consumers in particular, but also we look forward to having the fact of hearing from young people who are looking at this as a potential career, and we feel that this sort of legislation could be an example that which we can live with as consumers, we can live with as legislators, and I can say from the previous career as an educator, I could look forward to recruiting young people into this career, a career that has a future in this province, a career that provides a valuable service in this province, and a career that will allow Nova Scotians from one end of the province to the other to make a worthwhile income. So with those comments, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to the next stage as we move this legislation on. And when it comes to law amendments, I look forward to the opportunity to meeting some of the earlier witnesses that, or earlier stakeholders that the minister brought forth at that time. And I encourage Ms. Carter and Ms. Clark and Ms. Lathers to take the opportunity to appear in front of law amendments. It'll be a worthwhile experience, and I look forward to seeing them at that time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Glace Bay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to join my colleagues in looking forward to sending this bill on to the Law Amendments Committee, Mr. Speaker. The Cosmetology Association finds itself in a rather unenviable position of having the obligation but not the authority to protect patrons and staff in some 1,400 salons throughout this province, Mr. Speaker, with about currently some 6,000 licensed cosmetologists in Nova Scotia. So we can see the importance of such a bill, Mr. Speaker, and we can also see the importance of making sure that of paramount importance, above all, is consumer protection, which is a major part of this bill. Mr. Speaker, it's regulating the industry in terms of the Cosmetology Association and dealing with inspection and handling of complaints. And Mr. Speaker, it's important for all of the stakeholders throughout this to be heard from. And of course, as we all know very well, Mr. Speaker, that there is no better place for that to happen than before the Law Amendments Committee of the legislature. So, Mr. Speaker, keeping my remarks very brief, I would like to thank Kim Carter of the Cosmetology Association, who has kept us up to date on the happenings with this bill. In particular, I'd like to thank Amy O'Keefe of Glace Bay, who has been keeping me up to date on what has been happening. We have had some problems in the past with the bill, Mr. Speaker. We know that. We've had concerns raised about the bill. It's my understanding from the people involved, the major stakeholders within the industry itself, that those concerns have been worked out, that wording has been clarified and so on. But I would urge them and any others who would have any concerns whatsoever about the bill to make sure that they appear before the Law Amendments Committee. And with that in mind, Mr. Speaker, we look forward to moving the bill along to the Law Amendments Committee stage to hear from the stakeholders within this industry and moving on from there, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
Now a member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to have a few moments to talk on Bill number 52, an act with respect to the Cosmetology Act. And this is a bill that is relative. When I was education critic last year, Mr. Speaker, we also dealt with the same act before the House. And I'm glad to have an opportunity to talk a bit about the history around this particular piece of legislation and also a few minutes about the bill as it now stands. Mr. Speaker, I guess, cosmetology is one of those interesting professions that we all come in contact with on a regular basis. Everyone has to get their hair cut, at least for a part of their life anyway. At some point, some of us end up not having to get our hair cut as often as others. But at some point in our lives, Mr. Speaker, we all have to get a haircut. Mr. Speaker, that is, we go in, and I think at this point we take it for granted. We take for granted the hygiene issues. We take for granted the training that these professionals have. We take for granted the work that they do. We go in and we say, these are hairstylists. These are people who are doing the work for us. And I always think about when I'm in a shop, particularly, Mr. Speaker, getting my hair cut, you can see the certain things that are done for hygiene reasons, the barbicide, the cleanliness of the place. These are things that years ago were very important issues, as they are today. But they are important issues that created a regulatory framework, Mr. Speaker, a regulatory framework that resulted in a very clear delineation of what was a cosmetologist, what was a barber, and now more recently we have things called estheticians and the various things, nails, pedicures, manicures, even a certain amount of non-therapeutic massage work, Mr. Speaker, that is done by individuals that, to a lesser or greater extent, are either called cosmetologists or barbers now, Mr. Speaker. And as a result of that, we have a situation, as I said, in history, there was very strong regulations put in place with regard to this because there was very strong hygiene issues. And I'm not an expert in the history of it, Mr. Speaker. I'm not clear on why those issues grew at those times. Maybe, but for now, we have a tendency to accept these things as a given. And like a lot of regulations that have a long history, I think a lot of people in Nova Scotia begin to wonder, is there a reason to continue to regulate them at this level? Is there a reason to continue to provide detailed regulations and delineation of what a barber or a cosmetologist is? Well, Mr. Speaker, I got a very strong lesson last year when I was the education critic for our party on these very issues. I had an opportunity on a regular basis to meet with the barbers, various barbers in Nova Scotia, met with the Cosmetology Association, as I think all members of this House and all members of our caucus did. And I do know that, along with a member from Dartmouth North, we met with estheticians and representatives of a college that trains estheticians, Mr. Speaker. And that gave me a much better understanding of some of the issues that are now currently in place with regard to these things. Mr. Speaker, what's really clear is that there is still need for regulation of this profession. This profession requires regulation. It requires there be some level of protection of the consumers in Nova Scotia. And quite frankly, that's every Nova Scotian who ends up requiring some level of cosmetology service, Mr. Speaker. Whether it's getting your hair cut, whether it's getting a perm, whether it's getting your hair dyed, or a manicure, pedicure, non-therapeutic massage. Mr. Speaker, these are all things that are now covered under our Cosmetology Act and things that we must ensure the people of Nova Scotia have some level of protection. And this came up a couple of times. I know when we were in law amendments last year, we heard, Mr. Speaker, from people who were estheticians, who were very eager to see that their profession would be covered and regulated in some way by the Cosmetology Act. And they were talking about the fact, and I try not to be too glib about this. I'm not a person that goes out and gets a manicure and a pedicure on a regular basis. But I have talked to others who have, and there are issues. There are some people who, in this province and across North America, who are coming and setting up shops, and these shops aren't properly regulated. And we don't know the type of level of service, and we think, well, all it is, someone getting their nails done or whatever. Well, no, Mr. Speaker, it's much bigger than that. Very much damaged nails are a health risk. Well, that's right. But a damaged nail can cause very serious health risks, Mr. Speaker. And we're actually learning that a lot of estheticians are actually beginning to work sort of like the partnership between a dental hygienist or a dental assistant and a dentist. We're seeing estheticians beginning to work with dermatologists, Mr. Speaker, which I wasn't even aware of. So quite frankly, this is now a healthcare profession. Cosmetology will now be regulating people who work in the healthcare industry. Now, I think that clearly opens to people's minds. This is not just aesthetics. This is not just about, a haircut. This is much bigger than that, Mr. Speaker. This is about professionals who are working in our healthcare industry as well, Mr. Speaker. There are estheticians who do nails, who do work with feet, work with hands, that are doing work, Mr. Speaker, with dermatologists in their office. The dermatologist might, if you come into a dermatologist, is my understanding from law amendments last year, Mr. Speaker, if you come to a dermatologist, there might be some analysis, some diagnosis by the actual doctor, by the dermatologist, but then you might be passed on to someone in the office who is the esthetician, who will be doing the work of maybe you have particular problems with your hands or problems with your feet, Mr. Speaker. And in those circumstances, Mr. Speaker, there is a real need to ensure that those Nova Scotians have the protection they need. That's no longer about getting your hair cut, Mr. Speaker. That is now a health care concern. And Nova Scotians have to know, Mr. Speaker, that under the Cosmetology Act, they have regulations to protect them. And I'm hoping that this legislation will begin to address some of that as well, Mr. Speaker. That's what we heard at law amendments. And I must say, even if it isn't in the healthcare sector, which presumably there are certain standards that a dermatologist would want to meet in their office, whether it's regulated by the province or not, Mr. Speaker, there are standards that should still be met for people who walk in as consumers, who walk in off the street and are paying for the services of an esthetician. Mr. Speaker, that's an important part of cosmetology as well. And we heard of those who may set up shops who really aren't properly trained. I'm not sure how many of them there are in this province or what percentage of the profession there might be, but this is always an issue when you have professions, Mr. Speaker, that are not properly regulated in the province. There will be those that will live on the margins, that will set up shops, that will hang a shingle, will call themselves an esthetician, will call themselves, a nail shop. You may find that this is being done at places where they do it on the side, on top of, because you even remember, it used to be you had a hair salon, and people would go, and it would be a hair salon. Well, now we have tanning booths in these places. We have people who do nails. We have people who do feet. We even may have non-therapeutic massages happening in these places, Mr. Speaker. And as a result, a lot more health issues are coming into play. This legislation 10 years ago was probably adequate for what was cosmetology at the time. Cosmetology has changed, Mr. Speaker, and it's time that the legislation change with it. I'm glad to see the government has introduced this, because the shops that we have in our communities, Mr. Speaker, whether it be Eastern Passage in my community or Barrington Passage or any other place named Passage in this province, Mr. Speaker, they have shops, as everyone else does in this province, that are hair salons, but those hair salons are doing more. And it's vital that we have a Cosmetology Act and regulations that ensure that people are protected when they go in there. And there are issues that are coming up that are health issues. There are concerns that clearly, I know, talking to Ms. Carter last year on many occasions around this legislation and this act, Mr. Speaker, she had particular concerns about ensuring that we regulated those estheticians. And I'm glad to see this legislation coming forward, that estheticians are going to be covered and that we're going to have protection for the people of Nova Scotia. Well, Mr. Speaker, these are the things that need to be done. These are the things we need to ensure that consumers of this province are protected. And I think to a great extent in the past 15 or 20 years there's been some sense of deregulation, for lack of a better term, Mr. Speaker, with regard to cosmetology and with regard to consumer products generally. As I said, in North America, we've had, there's no institutional memory of the problems that maybe were caused when we had unregulated consumer activity, Mr. Speaker. 50, 60, 100 years ago, Mr. Speaker, we probably had shops opening that were calling themselves hairstylists, where maybe they didn't have any form of professional designation. There were no regulations protecting us. Barbers the same way. There's many other products that I can probably go through, Mr. Speaker. But the point is that, for our grandparents or our great-grandparents, they may recall some of the incidents that might have been causing health concerns, causing the spread of diseases, because there wasn't proper regulation. That is why the government stepped in when they did at those times. This maybe was, quite frankly, some of the earliest forms of consumer regulation, was the cosmetologists and barbers, Mr. Speaker. And what we have, I think, because it's been so long, Mr. Speaker, I think there's a tendency for us to forget that there was a requirement for this. Things have been going so well. We now recognize the need to regulate these professions as we do other consumer-related professions, Mr. Speaker. And as a result, I think many in this province who are younger, I could say even under the age of 80, Mr. Speaker, probably have no recollection of the need for regulating cosmetology. And Mr. Speaker, that's a problem. And that's a problem we have in this province, and it's a problem that, that quite frankly, is because we think then we end up going to the conclusion, well, why do we need the regulation at all? You know, and I always go back to the point when I'm sitting in that chair and I look at that bottle of blue barbicide. Why do they keep putting those combs in that barbicide? And I know there's a good reason, but I think to myself, you know, hygienically, I mean, clearly these are rules that have been in place for a long time. But to the average Nova Scotian, maybe we forget the reason why those regulations are in place. And it's legislation like this, it is a good reminder to the people in this House and to Nova Scotians generally, Mr. Speaker, that we need legislation. We need legislation to regulate these professions. That's why this legislation is before us today. And I think there's a tendency at times to be glib about it. And quite frankly, last year, I know when this legislation came forward, and I know talking even to the Minister of Health now, the former Minister of Education, there was a tendency to say, you know, this seems like such a simple piece of legislation, good legislation. Why is it becoming so complicated? Well, the fact is, Mr. Speaker, that at times, you know, again, in history, we had two professions that were particularly involved in the profession of cutting hair. I don't know if it was always divided on gender lines, but we had barbers, who I think most people in this province would recognize as hair cutters for men, and then you had cosmetologists or hairstylists who were hair cutters for women. Well, again, as I said, the issue's become much more complicated. And I actually understand now that, you know, where maybe 50, 60, 70 years ago, there were just as many barbers as there were cosmetologists, it's become quite different now. Talking to some of the cosmetologists last year, Mr. Speaker, there are now, I believe, a very much larger number of cosmetologists than there are barbers. And I know Mr. Boudreau, in fact, it's funny enough, the guy whose office is right next to my constituency office, his name is Bernie Boudreau, interesting name. He is actually a barber and a cosmetologist, and I'm beginning to understand that that's actually quite common as well. So that people can actually call themselves a barber for the purposes of men who may come in, but also, Mr. Speaker, there are who may feel more comfortable going to a barber for whatever reason. But also, Mr. Speaker, he's a cosmetologist. He has both licenses, and he's regulated by both associations. And as a result, Mr. Speaker, he also is able to do those things that only cosmetologists can do. And I remember asking this question last year, what is it a cosmetologist can do that a barber can't do? And at the time, Mr. Speaker, I was told it's about chemicals. And I said, well, what does that mean? Well, and again, what do I know? But I was told it was about giving perms, about dyeing hair, about some of the things. In fact, I remember talking to one barber, it was a woman who was here in this house last year, saying that she had some inspector come in. She was very upset. And I can understand, it's her profession. She is a barber. She chose that profession like I chose law or other people chose teaching. And it's a noble profession and one that she felt the need to go into, Mr. Speaker. And she opened a shop, you know, which is her right in this country, which is to open a shop and begin to say, I want to hang my shingle and be a barber. And the problem was, she said, that she was caught holding a bowl, which I believe was a bowl that had some sort of chemical in it for purposes of giving someone a perm or a dye job. And Mr. Speaker, because she was holding that bowl and she had a barber's license and not a cosmetology license, that was going to cause trouble to her. Now, some would say in Nova Scotia that, you know, has regulation gone awry? Is this things that maybe we should have been looking at through the, blue ribbon, red tape panel that members on the backbench of the Tory government looked at? Well, I don't know enough about it, Mr. Speaker, to say whether we need to have clear definitions of who can hold a bowl that has chemicals in it. But, Mr. Speaker, again, there are reasons and legitimate reasons for these regulations so that Nova Scotians have a clear understanding when they see that certificate on the wall. Are they a cosmetologist? Are they a barber, Mr. Speaker? Well, that depends. And it depends on what type of service you want to get. What we do have with this legislation, Mr. Speaker, are cosmetologists being regulated under the Cosmetology Act by their own association. They want the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to take the time to begin to have better regulations. And this is also caused because the profession has changed. As I noted earlier, estheticians are now a very strong component of a hairstyling shop, whether it's nails, whether it's feet, and again, those who do non-therapeutic massages, Mr. Speaker. I think that they need to know that when they hang their shingle, Mr. Speaker, and they say that they're a masseuse, or they say that they are a nail technician or a foot technician, or whatever the terms may be, pedicurist, I guess, or manicurist, Mr. Speaker, that they need to know that they are being protected because, quite frankly, there are very serious health risks with this as well, whether they're cracked nails or whether there is problems with their feet, Mr. Speaker. These are things that need to be addressed, and now we have a Cosmetology Act that's being modernized to reflect those changes, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that Nova Scotians have a good understanding that there is a real need for protection. Mr. Speaker, these are all about health and safety issues. And not just health and safety issues in the workplace, but health and safety issues for Nova Scotians. And Mr. Speaker, I know, having come from a background of workplace health and safety, that the regulations can be cumbersome at times. And in many cases, you know, if you work in an office or you work in a white-collar job, you have a tendency to not even consider health and safety from a regular basis. It's very funny because you walk into a government office and there is some health and safety issues, but we take them for granted. We don't have to wear a hard hat when we go into our workplace in a building. We don't have to wear safety boots. We don't have to talk about Scott packs or respiratory machines, Mr. Speaker. You know, we're not like the firefighters in this province who end up having to get cancer no matter where they work, whether they work for a municipality, whether they're volunteer firefighters, Mr. Speaker. These people have a higher preponderance of getting cancer because of the work they do. Those are health and safety issues. They probably have a better understanding of it, but the average white-collar worker, Mr. Speaker, does not. And as a result, I think we have a tendency again to assume that someone else out there is looking after our health and safety when we're doing and getting services from a cosmetologist. And that is why this legislation is important, Mr. Speaker, because it gives us an opportunity to reflect on what is important to ensure our health and safety is being protected as consumers. And Mr. Speaker, I know we're not allowed to go clause by clause, and I don't intend to, Mr. Speaker, but I think it is important that we do take some time to talk about the various clauses in this legislation that, as a principle, need to be addressed, Mr. Speaker. And I was noting that some of the things that I think will make this legislation much more effective, not only for consumers, but for cosmetologists. And one of them was appeal procedures are being improved with regard to examinations. And some might say, well, you know, what's the reason for doing that? Well, Mr. Speaker, I think it's very important, and this happens on a regular basis. In fact, it's not that different than our law amendments the other day. We were listening to people with regard to the Apprenticeship and Trades Qualifications Act. And, I mean, I'm not sure this is an apprenticeship trade, and maybe it is. I'm not absolutely sure. But I do know, Mr. Speaker, that it is a certified trade. It's one in which someone has to have a certificate in order to conduct work under it, Mr. Speaker. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason we have certain certified trades, right? Whether they be plumbers or mechanics or cosmetologists or barbers or many others out there, Mr. Speaker. We do this. Electricians, we do it because we want to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that the people of Nova Scotia are going to have work done that meets a minimum standard. A minimum standard. And I may want to note, by the way, not all electricians in this province have to be certified. Only construction work needs to be done by a certified electrician. So quite frankly, you're safer knowing that you're actually going to get your hair cut because we have certified people doing it than we are if we have industrial electricians doing work in a factory or we have industrial electricians doing work in our own homes for residential purposes, Mr. Speaker. They don't need to be certified. There's no guarantee of the level of qualifications that they have, Mr. Speaker. Yet because of the work of the Cosmetology Association and because of the Cosmetology Act, we have guarantees with regard to the protection of consumers, and that is very important. But my point, I digress a little, Mr. Speaker. My point is that we are in a position to talk about what happens if someone writes an exam. And this happens. I think all of us have people come into our office and they're very upset because they may have written an exam for an association or they were trying to write an exam, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, they've worked a long time to get to the point where and quite frankly, let's be clear, that there are a lot of people out there that end up going to private schools with regard to cosmetology. And they're not cheap. Private schools, private colleges that provide cosmetology or manicurist or pedicurist services that train them are quite expensive. And I recall, if the member from Dartmouth North may correct me, but when we met with a woman who has a college, I think it's the Maritime Beauty College or something like that in Dartmouth, Maritime Academy of Beauty or something like that in Dartmouth, She was saying that one of the changes in this legislation would be the number of hours. Sorry. Maritime Academy of Cosmetology. I thank the member from Dartmouth North for correcting me on the record. They, Mr. Speaker, have an opportunity now, because of the extra hours, to get that extra training. Now, of course, that also means they're going to pay more. They're going to pay a heck of a lot more, Mr. Speaker, to become a manicurist, to become a pedicurist. And I remember at the time, this woman, as principal of that school, was quite upset. She said, is this required? How's this going to affect us? And she specifically said the problem is that I'm competing not only in Nova Scotia, but I'm competing against New Brunswick and Toronto and Alberta and Boston. Let's face it, globalization is not just about, the extension of trade, it's about opening up educational services as well. And the problem is that why should I if I have to take 4 years to finish my manicurist course here in Nova Scotia, or 3 years or 2 years or whatever it may be, why don't I just go to New Brunswick? And you know what, maybe I won't come back here and work, because the requirements in Nova Scotia mean I have to have more requirements. I'll go work in Fredericton. I'll go work in Quebec City. I will go work somewhere else where they don't have the same standards. And this is the problem that we always have in the federal system and in regard to the United States as well, Mr. Speaker. Because whenever you try and regulate to improve standards, and you're the first one over the trench, you're the first one to say, we think you need higher standards to be an esthetician in Nova Scotia. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's something the Cosmetology Act thinks was important. That's something the Cosmetology Association thinks is important. And they are the people that regulate this important profession. That, Mr. Speaker, it's pretty clear that they must have some sense of why it's important. Well, Mr. Speaker, when you do that, and you're the first to talk about increasing the number of hours required before you can be approved and certified, you're always going to be competing against those other provinces that haven't done it. And there's always the fear that you have students here who will decide not to go to school here, will decide not to practice here, but will decide to go somewhere else. Will decide to leave and to go to another province. And as a result, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians, particularly those who run colleges, were worried about how this would impact them. Well, my point is, though, when you have examinations, you need a procedure to ensure that they can appeal, and that is in this legislation. And I hope that this will help in some way to address some of the issues that were raised by the colleges that teach estheticians, teach manicurists, teach pedicurists, Mr. Speaker. I would hope that this would have some means of ensuring that Nova Scotians who are in the process of becoming a cosmetologist have an opportunity, if they write an exam, to have an appeal procedure. This legislation seems to address that. I'm glad to see that the Cosmetology Association has considered this and is thinking about this as an important issue. Just as important, Mr. Speaker, and I know from my own profession, as you probably do from yours, any profession cannot be properly regulated unless there's a complaints and discipline procedure as well. And I see that this legislation is going to begin to recognize that as a principle of good cosmetology legislation. I'm sure it was in there before, but now it's being approved. Again, if cosmetology has changed over the past 13 years, Mr. Speaker, or the past 20 years, if we've had changes in the legislation, if we had changes in the nature of the industry, then I think it's vital that we make changes in the legislation to ensure that the complaints process and the discipline process, Mr. Speaker, is also updated. And this can be very cumbersome. It can be very difficult. And I know that members don't always like to see these because they start worrying that when you make things more complicated or when you have complaints processes, things become bogged down and they worry they have to get lawyers, and that makes things much more longer over a longer period of time. Well, Mr. Speaker, that is a real concern of all Nova Scotians. No one wants to see an overly litigious society. No one wants to see complaints process become bogged down in legal wranglings or having to be appealed to courts if they're not happy with decisions. But the problem is, Mr. Speaker, that if you don't have a complaints process, it's really the rule of law for the association. If you don't have it, then how do you deal with a complaint? If I have a complaint against an esthetician or against a cosmetologist or someone else in this province does, where do I go? How do I deal with it? Well, Mr. Speaker, the Cosmetology Act spells that out, and I'm glad to see it does, and I'm glad to see it's changing with the times and is identifying the changes that need to be done to ensure that Nova Scotians have the ability to have a legitimate complaint raised and dealt with by the association. This is a self-regulated profession, no different than lawyers or doctors or nurses or many other organizations and professionals in this province, Mr. Speaker, and as a result, it is vital, I say vital, that Nova Scotians have a means of knowing their complaints are going to be dealt with. Of course, there's also the discipline. That's what happens if you have complaints. There must be some means of disciplining. Revocation of a certificate to enable them to be cosmetologists, or potentially a suspension. I'm sure these are things that are in the Act. But again, as our society changes, as we change the rules and they reflect what cosmetology is today in Nova Scotia, I think it's also important, Mr. Speaker, that discipline and complaint processes also be updated. And I'm glad to see, again, the Cosmetology Association has been very proactive in trying to ensure that their legislation is up to date and that they are protecting consumers in Nova Scotia. I give full credit to Ms. Carter and her group for the efforts that they have made to ensure that Nova Scotians have the protection they need to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that they have what they can when they go to an association. Mr. Speaker, that is really all this is about, is protecting consumers. And as I say, I think a lot of Nova Scotians have an assumption about the health and safety when they walk into a shop to get their hair cut, or a manicurist or a pedicurist, Mr. Speaker. And as a result, I think there's an opportunity here for them, and for particularly as their representatives here, to have an opportunity to consider some of the work that's being done by the association to protect them. Mr. Speaker, I guess there's also permits that are given out for schools and for salons as well. And that's very important, because what can happen, Mr. Speaker, is you can have a single permit for an individual. And if you have an individual that has 6 or 7 cosmetologists working in the shop, again, given the changing time, they may not all be hairstylists. There may be some who are non-therapeutic masseuses. There may be manicurists or pedicurists or others, Mr. Speaker. As a result of that, there may be not one person or one organization ensuring that that salon actually has the ability to be properly regulated. Yes, there's an owner. I think in many cases that, what we need is some sort of license to ensure, and I'm glad to see that this Act and this legislation is beginning to address that as well, is ensuring, Mr. Speaker, that Nova Scotians know that those shops are being properly handled as well. I know the employers are protected to some extent by Labour Standards Code in this province. I would argue not very well. Labour Standards Codes in this province is abominable. It's antiquated. It's probably the worst in Nova Scotia, worst in Canada. I would suggest Mississippi might be one of the only places in North America that has worse labor standards legislation than this province, Mr. Speaker. But I don't mean to insult Mississippi in that process. But, Mr. Speaker, the point is that the consumers that go into these salons need to know that there's protection. And again, the Cosmetology Association, through licensing of these shops, is ensuring that. And again, schools as well. Again, remember Dartmouth North and I met with schools, met with people who are involved in teaching these professions, Mr. Speaker, and as a result, there is definitely a need to ensure that the standards are being met. And we talked about this as well under the Apprenticeship and Trade Qualification Act. One of the biggest problems we have in certifiable trades and professions, Mr. Speaker, is coordination between the school that teaches and the organization that certifies. And very rarely are the two the same. Very rarely, Mr. Speaker, for example, if I go to a law school, the law school dictates its curriculum, decides what courses it's going to teach. But how does that coordinate with the bar admission course that I may write as a lawyer? Or as a doctor, I may go to a medical school. How does that coordinate with the medical society's requirements for me to become a doctor when I write my exams? Well, the same thing occurs, Mr. Speaker, with regard to cosmetology. You have schools that are out there, entrepreneurs in some cases, hardworking people, professionals that are trying to raise money and make a living, and part of that is they create a school. And that school is there to ensure that those students receive a proper education, and then, quite frankly, they have one of the best ways they have of encouraging someone to come to their school as compared to their competition is by saying, 95% of the people in our school pass the exam. Well, that means that they are clearly meeting the standards that are required by the Cosmetology Association to pass the certification exam, Mr. Speaker. That is a very important component of the legislation, one that I think, Mr. Speaker, needs to be addressed, and I'm glad to see the legislation is doing that. I would also like to see, Mr. Speaker, the opportunity for more coordination between the schools and what's going on with regard to the legislation as well. And I would say that those schools, Mr. Speaker, would have an opportunity to do that, would have an opportunity.
Order, please. The honourable member allowed for an
Oh,
intervention.
yeah, sure.
Thank you. The honourable member for Peck East.
Thank you to the member, Cole Harbour Eastern Passage, for yielding this time for a moment till I do an introduction. We have in our gallery today, and very pleased to have 15 students of the Westville Occupational Preparation Program, better known as the OPP program, and it's a graduating class. the last one from what we will soon call the old Westville High School. The classes will soon be in the fall held in the new state-of-the-art high schools in Pictou West and Pictou East. Along with the 15 students, we have teacher Bruce Moore, and welcome back to the legislature, Bruce. And also Mike Hawley is assisting Bruce with the class today, and I hope they enjoy their stay in Halifax. And I'd ask the members to welcome them in the usual manner.
We welcome our guest to the gallery today, the honourable member for Cole Harbour, Eastern Passions. Thank you for the time. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm glad to see there's a class here because, quite frankly, you know, this, as my colleague from Timberley Prospect noted, as our education critic and as a former administrator and teacher, that there are many who choose this profession. There's many in schools that when they're starting to leave high school decide, what am I going to do? Am I going to go to university? Am I going to go to community college? You know, many of them choose to go to cosmetology schools, Mr. Speaker, both here and in other provinces. And I want to talk about 2 points there. Particularly, first of all, as I said, there needs to be coordination between the Cosmetology Association and the schools. And by issuing licenses to schools so that they're able to have some level of coordination, that is vital. It's vital, Mr. Speaker, because Nova Scotians then know that they have an opportunity when they go to know that the curriculum they're taking in those schools, and as again, I say, they pay a lot of money for these colleges. I say $5,000, it could be more. But they pay a lot of money to learn that training, and it's a very important training. And it's not just about learning to cut hair, it's about the safety, it's about the hygiene, it's about the artistic. I mean, it's a very fascinating profession when you think about it, Mr. Speaker. You're looking at both the skill and art and also the hygiene issues that are involved. And as I said, in some cases, some choose very different paths. Some will become hairstylists. Some will end up going into more institutional settings. Some will go into medical. As we said, those who work in dermatologist offices, Mr. Speaker, end up going into the healthcare system. And all this is being taught at one school. One school that's got to meet all those standards and all those levels, Mr. Speaker. And I would say to you, that's a very difficult and cumbersome thing to do. And I'm glad to see that we now have, with the Cosmetology Act and the Cosmetology Association, a vibrant, proactive association that is out there ensuring that there is some coordination. I think that was, as I said, when we met with some of the people who were teaching aesthetics and manicure and pedicure issues, I think they were concerned last year. I think the member from Dartmouth North would agree. They were concerned whether that coordination was happening. How were they notified about these extended hours that need to be required, Mr. Speaker? What did they know about them? Well, Mr. Speaker, the point is that now I hope that is happening. Now that they all come under the umbrella of cosmetology, I hope that there is an opportunity in Nova Scotia for more coordination. Presumably now that licenses are being issued or that we're renewing the opportunity to issue licenses under the amendments to the legislation, Mr. Speaker, I would presume that there would be a bigger opportunity and a greater opportunity for that coordination. That is, again, vital to ensure that not only is someone going to when someone spends $5,000 to $10,000 for a course to become a cosmetologist or an esthetician, Mr. Speaker, they need to know that that course is going to meet the standards, going to help them pass that exam later on. Certification, Mr. Speaker, is the end goal. School is the way in which they get there and learn the trade so they can pass that exam, both written and I presume there's also some form of clinical exam as well, Mr. Speaker. But in order to pass those exams, they need to get through school, and there needs to be that coordination. And I would think if I was a principal or owner of a school, I'd be very worried, Mr. Speaker, if I was providing a curriculum that was not in coordination with the Cosmetology Association. I would be nervous because what would eventually happen is the reputation of my school would be, you know what, they're teaching things that I don't need to know for the exam. And again, those in other professions know. I know from law school. There was always the debate in law school. Should I take the courses that I like, or should I take the courses I need to take in order to pass the bar exam? And maybe the other members who went to law school may have some recollection of that. But there was the whole debate about, should I take, because I must admit, I was never big on real estate or wills in estate law, Mr. Speaker. But the point was, if you didn't take them, it would be a lot tougher to pass the bar later. So a lot of people would only take the courses that they knew were going to be part of the bar exam. And in many cases, they lost out on some of the other courses they might have found more interesting. Now, there are other... That's right, cosmetology law, that's right. There are others, Mr. Speaker, who may be administrative law, right? Administrative law deals with complaints and discipline procedures under the Cosmetology Act. See? So there is a connection between the two. But, Mr. Speaker, there are those in law, just following through with my thought, there are those in law, Mr. Speaker, who only took the courses they liked. And I saw those. When they went to the bar admission course, you could tell that they were having a much tougher time cramming and working and studying for those bar admission courses because they maybe didn't take real estate or wills and estates or criminal law. They knew what they were doing when they wanted to go in. But they made that compromise at the time. But maybe, Mr. Speaker, again, with the coordination with the Cosmetology Association, we would have the opportunity to ensure that those Nova Scotians, young Nova Scotians primarily, who want to go into the profession, know that because in many cases they're trusting the school, that they're going to provide a curriculum that's going to ensure that they're going to have a better chance to pass that exam. And as I say, the reputation of a school relies on what percentage of their students are passing the exam, what percentage are being certified as cosmetologists. And Mr. Speaker, that is very difficult to do if your curriculum is not coordinated with the association on what they're asking for on their exam. And as I say, as the profession has changed, it's involved in healthcare now. Dermatologists' office have estheticians. Mr. Speaker, what if, we're talking about institutional settings? Well, Mr. Speaker, as the profession changes, it's the Cosmetology Association and this act that regulates that association, Mr. Speaker, that will be the one to ensure that as the profession changes, the standards are being met. And again, Ms. Carter and her organization have done a wonderful job of doing that. What's important is that they also have the ability to regulate and to also coordinate with the schools. And by issuing permits to those schools, Mr. Speaker, there is a much greater opportunity for them to be able to do that. Mr. Speaker, that's all that's really being considered in here. And again, I go back to my original point, that this is about the protection and the health and safety and the hygiene of consumers in Nova Scotia. And everyone in this province at some time or another has to get a haircut. And to a lesser extent, Mr. Speaker, they also have to deal with the other issues that they may have with regard to cosmetology. And as a result, this legislation is incredibly important for them to be able to do that. There are also schools, Mr. Speaker, there may be Nova Scotians who will say to themselves, why should I go here? We've just extended the number of hours we need to become an esthetician, or the amount of hours we need in order to become a cosmetologist, Mr. Speaker. And quite frankly, there might be someone who will say, you know what? I'll go and become a barber instead. Well, these issues need to be ironed out, and I'm glad to see last year there were a lot of issues that came up around barbers versus cosmetologists. I was glad to see some of this is being ironed out. I might note that I don't think there's anyone in this province right now that's teaching barbering, Mr. Speaker. I could be wrong. There was a guy in New Glasgow, but I don't think he's teaching it anymore. So, in some ways, the number of barbers has really diminished, and maybe someday in the near future, I'll be sad to say that the profession may be gone. But at the point now, cosmetology is a much bigger profession, but at the same point, I would hope that they would reflect the need to have the standards that are being met by the cosmetologists. They're being proactive, Mr. Speaker. They are considering the needs not only of their practitioners, but of the consumers, of the school principals, of the owners of schools, of those who run hairstyling shops and esthetician shops and manicurists and pedicurists. They're considering their needs, and on a regular basis, they're trying to update it to ensure standards are being met for certification. That is vital. This legislation, quite frankly, is one of the components they need to continue to be able to be proactive, not only for their members, but for the consumers in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. That is why this legislation is so important. I'm proud to support this legislation. I don't know if I've mentioned that yet, but I will be supporting this legislation. But it's important to have the opportunity to talk about what exactly cosmetologists are doing, Mr. Speaker, and why they need to have the regulation that they have. Mr. Speaker, there's also a power, I believe, in here for inspections. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure. And again, inspecting is one of those things. I talked about the rule of law. I talked about why in Nova Scotia we need to have rules and a rule of law with regard to cosmetology, as we do for lawyers and doctors and nurses and many other professions, Mr. Speaker. But as a result, this is something that was always talked about, when I used to do health and safety, education versus enforcement. And no one would deny that you need both. You need to educate your membership. You need to educate practitioners. Things change in the profession. Profession changes. It's an opportunity to continue to provide ongoing education to them to ensure that they know those changes and they're able to adapt and ensure that Nova Scotians, again, not only protected, but are provided with the best service possible. Well, Mr. Speaker, the same thing with regard to inspections. Education can only go so far. There will always be those that will push the envelope, will try and skirt the rules, try and avoid regulation, for whatever reason, because of time, because of a shortness of cash flow in their business. There are always reasons. You know, at the time they may seem legitimate, Mr. Speaker, no matter the business, but the fact is, in the long run, they need to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that they are protected as consumers when they go into those shops. Inspections are a vital component of that. I noted earlier a barber who said that he or she was caught holding a bowl of chemicals and was upset that these rules are being put in place, that it prevented her from being able to do what she needed to do, Mr. Speaker. But the fact is, they're there for a reason. I'm not familiar enough with cosmetology to know exactly the reason why barbers can't handle chemicals, but there is a legitimate reason, and I'm glad to see the Cosmetology Association is there to ensure that this is being done. Well, Mr. Speaker, those are some of the things that inspections can catch, some of the things that inspections can pick up on. I'm looking forward to law amendments, maybe to hear from Ms. Carter and others as to how many inspections there actually are. Who does the inspecting? Is it their association? I assume to some extent it is, but at some point they have to, and I would think their job has become much more difficult, because now that they have estheticians covered under their legislation, Mr. Speaker, now that they have manicurists and pedicurists and non-therapeutic masseuses in their organization, there are those that were not regulated that are now going to have to understand that they cannot practice without meeting certification. That's a big hurdle to cross. Some of these people were working in other countries or working in other provinces, Mr. Speaker. Maybe they didn't have to get certified there. Maybe the certification didn't meet the standards we had in Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia has been proactive because of this association in recognizing the need to improve standards, to increase standards, to make sure people are protected as consumers. Well, Mr. Speaker, to do that, you need inspections and inspectors to go out and check those facilities that maybe, just maybe, aren't meeting those standards. That's what the inspection process is for. I'm glad to see this act has the teeth to give the inspections and the inspectors the power to go out and ensure the regulations are being maintained. I wish we had the same mandate and the same commitment from the government of Nova Scotia with regard to occupational health and safety or environmental protection. You know, the fact is, because this is being done by a private organization, it's self-regulated, they are much more committed and they have to meet a higher standard. Because quite frankly, the government will say, if you do not properly regulate your own industry, things will be done to prevent you from regulating your industry. That's the threat that's always handed over to the Barrister Society or the Medical Society or the Cosmetology Association or any other number of organizations, Mr. Speaker. They're threatened with, you are self-regulated because we trust you. If you break that trust, we will do something. We will bring down the hammer and prevent that from happening. Well, the sad fact is, Mr. Speaker, we don't have those same rules with regard to health and safety in the workplace or environmental protection because the government is the one that does the inspecting and the enforcement, and they do it as they see fit. And I always remember one of my first days as an articling clerk with the Attorney General in Ontario, with the Ministry of Labour, I was asked, because the legislation all said with regard to inspectors, the inspector may enter a workplace, the inspector may issue orders, the inspector may do this, may do that. And that was always the classic component. You know, if there's one word that's important to a government lawyer or the government generally to prevent from being sued in occupational health and safety and environmental protection legislation, it's the word may. Because that one word means you can't sue them because they may enter. It doesn't mean they have a duty to enter. And that is there's so many hats been hung on by governments in this country saying, you know what, maybe we didn't see that oil spill. Maybe we didn't see that accident in the workplace. But the fact is, we didn't have to go in. We may go in. And in those circumstances, Mr. Speaker, many Nova Scotians and many Canadians have suffered greatly because the government isn't prepared to have strict regulations in those areas. Yet the government, with regard to the Cosmetology Act, has agreed, because it's self-regulated, because it doesn't cost them a dime, to ensure that cosmetologists have proper inspections, have proper procedures to ensure that they have inspectors that are going out there and regularly and routinely checking on businesses to make sure that they are meeting the licenses they have for their salon. They're going to schools to make sure the schools are meeting the standards that they have to for their licenses and permits, and are making sure that certified cosmetologists, which now include estheticians and manicurists and pedicurists, Mr. Speaker, also get a certain level of protection. And again, education on one side, yes. I'm glad to see the schools are now coordinating with the Cosmetology Association. But at the same time, you need inspections. You need the ability to go out and ensure that there is someone who's going to come around from time to time and do the inspections to protect workers. And Mr. Speaker, that is what's required. That's what Nova Scotians need. and I'm glad to see that that's the case. Mr. Speaker, this is legislation that is changing with the times. This is legislation, Mr. Speaker, that is ensuring that cosmetologists in this province have the protection they need, and that the consumers in Nova Scotia have the protection they need when they go into a shop. Mr. Speaker, we heard last year when legislation came forward at that time with regard to the Cosmetology Act, we heard, Mr. Speaker, about individual situations, mainly from cosmetologists. Ms. Carter did a very effective job of bringing forward representations from estheticians and cosmetologists about the problems they had with the legislation, not with the legislation, but with the legislation before the changes, about those who weren't regulated. Very compelling stories, stories that we knew needed to be addressed. And Mr. Speaker, that is what was so important about hearing it last year. And quite frankly, there were bumps on the road. As, again, the Minister of Health, who was Minister of Education at the time, knew there were bumps on the road to ensure that there was coordination not only within the Cosmetology Association, but as they took over the regulation of estheticians, as they had to coordinate with barbers who do very similar work but are separately regulated, Mr. Speaker. I think a lot of political lessons were learned by the Cosmetology Association. They were learned by the Barbers Association. Quite frankly, they were learned by members in this House as we began to understand exactly the problems that were being faced in regulating similar but slightly different, if not greatly different, professions. And Mr. Speaker, that is a problem. As I said, in Nova Scotia, we have barbers, we have cosmetologists. Cosmetologists are a much bigger organization by membership numbers than the barbers. And Mr. Speaker, it's important that Nova Scotians know that no matter which one they go to, they have consumer protection. I'm glad to see the Cosmetology Association is proactive, is taking the time to go out, Mr. Speaker, and talk, to consult, to bring forward legislation that will be protecting consumers. That's the complaint process I talked about. That's a disciplinary process I talked about. It's about education. It's about coordinating with schools. And one of the things I forgot to mention, Mr. Speaker, about schools is that, one of the difficulties we have in our federal system is that we have rules in Nova Scotia. We're in this legislature because under the Constitution of Canada, we have rules that say that we regulate cosmetology, as Ontario and Alberta and British Columbia does. But the problem is how much coordination is going on amongst the various associations or regulatory bodies like the Department of Education as to what we put in. Do we have harmonized rules? I presume not. I believe Nova Scotia has moved to increase the rules, increase the standards, because they think it's important, that association does. I trust them in that, Mr. Speaker. But the fact is that in doing that, there are other provinces, whether it be the Maritime provinces or other parts of Canada, I don't know which ones have or have not increased their standards. Maybe we're the first. But, Mr. Speaker, in having increased our standards, we take the chance of being those, as I said, the first over the trench. And in doing that, there's also the possibility that many people that might have chosen to do their trade here may go somewhere else. They also means those who are unregulated, who aren't meeting standards, are also going to go somewhere else. And that may be a good thing. But, Mr. Speaker, it also means that Nova Scotians will have that level of protection. This is always the battle we have. Should we protect Nova Scotians, or should we allow the free market to dictate? Well, Mr. Speaker, I think in this case with the Cosmetology Association, we've recognized the need for regulation. As we've said, historically, there always has been regulation, or at least in the past 50 or 60 years of this profession. And it's important that that continue. I think Nova Scotians, as I said, have taken this for granted. But I think as a result of this legislation, as a result of some of the issues that came up last year, there are people out there that now have a much better understanding of how Nova Scotians are being protected, Mr. Speaker. And one of the other things that is in the legislation is enforcement. And, Mr. Speaker, enforcement, again, something that I'm somewhat familiar with from other situations, Mr. Speaker. Enforcement is something that can take many forms. And I would hope through the law amendments process we may hear of some of the more creative ways in which we can enforce legislation. If someone isn't properly complying with the Cosmetology Act, if someone is operating an unregulated manicure shop, or if someone is violating the conditions of their certification as a cosmetologist, Mr. Speaker, there are things that can be done. Fines, obviously, are the easy answer. I would hope the fines in this legislation, and again, I wait to hear from law amendments as to the members of the association and others have to think. I would hope that the legislation, Mr. Speaker, would have fines that would ensure that Nova Scotians would be properly protected.
Order, please. Honourable Member Keeper Nova on a point of order. On introduction.
Mr. Speaker, I'm advised that in your gallery, a former member of this House and of the Executive Council, the Honourable Glenn Bagnall, who was Minister of the Environment, then called the Water Act, but who served in that capacity and many others in this House and from 1974 and afterwards. I'm sure we'd all want to welcome him here to our midst this afternoon.
Certainly welcome Mr. Bagnall to the gallery today, and hope you enjoy the proceedings. And his wife as well. Thank you. Shirley, is it? Yes, sure. Welcome, Shirley. Y'all member Cole Harbour Eastern Passage has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How much time do I have remaining?
Approximately 11 minutes.
Thank you. Talking about enforcement, Mr. Speaker, there are various ways, and this is one thing that I've been glad to see, I think, legally in the last 10 years. There's been more creative ways of addressing enforcement. Fines are one option, of course. And of course, there's always the threat of jail that's usually put into most legislation. But quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, in these sort of quasi-criminal circumstances, I doubt that these are things that, depending on the nature of the violation, would be used on a regular basis. There is obviously revocation of a license, a suspension of a license. These are things that are done. And Mr. Speaker, you know, there are many different ways. I remember, harking back to some of my experiences, there's very creative ways in which you can actually address. If these are issues of hygiene, if these are issues of health and safety of the consumer, you know, I would hope that the association and this legislature might look at opportunities to see how we can creatively try and ensure that Nova Scotians are protected and that those who violate the regulations of the Cosmetology Act are given some level. You know, I mean, there's things taking ads out in newspapers. If there's an issue of a cosmetologist who maybe wasn't properly protecting the hygiene or the health and safety of consumers, maybe there should be a way of providing advertisement, forcing them to put ads in newspapers, spelling out some of the hygiene issues that need to be addressed. You know, that's just one example. There are many other things. There are instead of fining, you can put the money towards a foundation or an organization or maybe even the Cosmetology Association for education, so that cosmetologists can be properly educated on an ongoing basis. That's something sometimes we forget, but using those fines for creative reasons to ensure that the cosmetologists are able to continue. And then, of course, another one is you can also, endowment, yes, an endowment. You can also put in place, Mr. Speaker, you know, a requirement of an order that they have to do a certain amount of, continuing education in their field. I'm not sure if the legislation addresses continuing education. I would suggest to you, Mr. Speaker, like most professions, things change very quickly, rapidly in this day and age. And I would hope that the legislation would have in place certain rules that would ensure that there's continuing education. Not all professions do. Not all professions require it. Some are lucky enough to call it self-study. But there are ways in which we can ensure that we're providing some level of continuing education. And if not, at least when someone violates the Act, when someone is brought before a disciplinary hearing, if someone is charged under the legislation, has to go before a court, let's give the adjudicators, whether they be judges or tribunal people or disciplinary committee chairs, give them the power to provide some creative ways of ensuring enforcement. Because fines are obviously important. I'd be the first one to say that. But Mr. Speaker, sometimes someone learns a lot more if they have to go back and get that continuing education. Maybe if they have to give that money to an endowment that goes towards education. Mr. Speaker, these are all ways of doing it. And it's good to community service. That's another one. You know, maybe from time to time, if we get too wrapped up in our business and things happen and we end up violating professional guidelines under the Cosmetology Act or other legislation, maybe an opportunity to do community services might be an opportunity for people to really appreciate what they're doing and the fact that there is a need for them to ensure that they continue to meet those standards. Because let's remember, Mr. Speaker, a license to be a cosmetologist, like a license to be a lawyer or a doctor or a teacher, is a privilege, not a right. And as a result, we must ensure that we always understand that it is a privilege. And every day, when we make decisions in our jobs, we should always have in the back of our mind that privilege of being and having a license to perform that profession. As I said, there were students in the gallery earlier. Some of them are going to decide to go into cosmetology, most likely. It's a very popular profession. They're going to decide to go in and do that because they want to. I'm proud for them for making that decision. But once you start down that road, paying large tuition fees, going to school, getting certification, you're also entering into a contract with the association and with the people of Nova Scotia that you will meet the standards required to be a professional cosmetologist. That's why we have these standards, because when people walk into those doors of a shop, they need to know they're protected. And many of us don't even assume. That's something good. You know, Mr. Speaker, I've had the opportunity to travel around other parts of the world, and not a lot, but some. And Mr. Speaker, I've observed and had an opportunity to see, standards in the third world, and this is one of the differences. In Canada, in the United States, in Western Europe, there are standards and there are acts like the Cosmetology Act in place to know that when we walk through a door, we're meeting standards. If you walk through the door of a shop in Beijing to get your hair cut, are they meeting standards? Are they meeting the standards that they're required to meet here? I have no guarantee of that. I have no guarantee that they have a certificate on the wall or that certificate was properly obtained or that they had to meet a standard they would have to meet. Now people say, well, that's just getting your hair cut. No. There are the hygiene issues, the health and safety issues, Mr. Speaker. These are all issues that need to be addressed, and we have an association here that is doing that, and I'm proud to say that they are continuing to be proactive in how they do it. They're prepared to continue to ensure that their legislation is top of the line. And Mr. Speaker, as a result, Nova Scotians know, and this is one of the great things about living in Canada, when they walk through the door of a hair salon or they go in to get the manicure or pedicure, they know, Mr. Speaker, that they have standards that are being met, that certification on the wall means something, that there are inspections taking place, Mr. Speaker, that there is education going on, that there is enforcement of the legislation, that those that are unregulated, those who set up shops that don't meet the standards, who do not have a certificate, will be quickly shut down. These are the things we do so that we don't even have to think about it. This is sort of the invisible hand of regulation, to sort of misquote Adam Smith. The invisible hand of regulation. As part of the market system, they go hand in hand. Mr. Speaker, the invisible hand of regulation will go out and ensure that when I walk into a shop, if I walk into a butcher, I know certain standards are being met. I walk into a restaurant, I know certain standards are being met. I walk into a hairstylist to get my hair cut, I know certain standards are being met. That's what defines, in many cases, the difference between a country like Canada and the living standards we have and countries in the rest of the world and other parts of the world where the standards maybe aren't being met. And there's no guarantee that a certificate on the wall was not gotten in a nefarious way or that there's no certificate required at all. And again, we've assumed in the history, we've relegated to history the reasons why we regulate cosmetology so strictly, why we have such strict hygiene issues. Well, Mr. Speaker, maybe most of us have forgotten that. Maybe most of us never knew why. But that's a good sign. That's a sign that regulations have been working. But regulations only work when they're updated. Regulations only work when we have an opportunity to ensure that Nova Scotians know that as times change, as the profession changes, there is also procedures in place to ensure that the Cosmetology Association is updated, that the act and the legislation that governs certification is updated. That is why we're here. That is what this legislation is for. And people will say this is just legislation that needs to be housekeeping, some people will call it. Well, you know what? I think it's important that we take the time to talk about this legislation. I think it's important that we take the time to talk about the fact that on a regular basis this legislation comes forward. I think we need to reflect that this is one of the most important jobs a government can do. It is regulating professions to ensure consumers are protected. That's a very important job of the government, one that I would suggest is one of the most important. I'm glad to have the opportunity to get up here and talk about it, Mr. Speaker, because I know that Nova Scotians, when they go to a hairdressing shop, may not know exactly why there's a regulation, may not know how they're being regulated, but Mr. Speaker, I think they do trust that they are. And it's only in those circumstances, Mr. Speaker, where they're not that we end up finding the problems. I think one of the biggest ones in recent history would be Westray, where we found that we were not properly regulating and enforcing legislation to protect workers. Not consumers necessarily, but workers. And people are outraged to find out, and I'm sure the Minister of Labour who was here and the Minister of Finance who were members at the time have a very good memory that among other reasons, that's why their government was defeated in 1993, because people were outraged what they thought was a sort of a broken bond of trust between a government and the people of this province, that there would be proper regulation to ensure things like that didn't happen, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, I also suggest to you that this type of legislation is vitally important to ensure that that bond of trust of proper regulation occurs. Mr. Speaker, I would also say to you, in this day and age, if we talk about things like SARS and other infectious diseases, Mr. Speaker, that it's even more important that we ensure we have proper regulation. You know, there's a lot of people who've been afraid to go to Toronto lately because of SARS. Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to see that the World Health Organization has finally taken them off the list of places that were under a SARS alert. But the point is, Mr. Speaker, one of the ways, again, just reading from the general media, newspapers, television, that one of the biggest problems with SARS is that the virus actually stays on things for a longer period of time than your average virus. Average virus can die quite quickly, but this can stay on a railing or on a chair for a while, and then if someone else touches it a couple hours later, they may pick it up if they touch their eye or face. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's a major problem. More important that we have, again, an association and legislation that is keeping pace with the times to ensure that Nova Scotians have Cosmetology Act and regulations that will ensure hygiene is at the top level. That SARS and other infectious diseases that we now have may continue. And we don't know what's going to happen in the future. We don't know what type of other types of infectious diseases may be created or caused, Mr. Speaker. And as a result, it's important that we have an association that is diligent, that is proactive, that is doing the job it must do, Mr. Speaker, to ensure the workers who work in that profession are protected, to ensure that the people of Nova Scotia are protected. That's what consumers need, Mr. Speaker. That's what the people of Nova Scotia need, and I'm glad to have had some time to speak directly on the Cosmetology Act. Thank you.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill number 52.
Motion to adjourn debate on Bill number 52. Is agreed? I only heard one member call for recorded vote. Two members have called recorded vote. Yes, there was. Yep. Two members call recorded vote. We'll ring the bells to the satisfaction of the whips. Order, please. Shut them off. Shut the bells off. Shut them off.
you.